When I was in high school, my mother was married to a man named Donald. Now, Donald was a drunk. He worked a good job and made good money, so he provided for us well enough. But he filled his free time chugging vodka like water in his underwear on the couch. Donald wasn't always aggressive when he drank. However, after a hard day at work, he would come home, drink a bottle, and try to pick fights with me for anything he could think of. Very often, these fights would turn physical, and while I was no lightweight in high school, on the first occasion I fought back, he called the cops on me. As a result of this situation, once he was about 3/4 of the way through a bottle, my mother took to packing an overnight bag, having me load up and go to stay in a hotel for the night. I always stayed in the same hotel, just down the street from my house, since it would allow me to go back home before school the next morning after Donald had left for work to get ready. It was a nice place with a huge open foyer that all of the rooms surrounded, going up 5 stories. I knew the ladies at the desk really well, as I was there 5 to 6 times a month. On the occasion in question, I had gone over fairly late in the evening. The hotel had 24-hour booking at the front desk, but the girl behind the desk said they were booked up for the night. I breathed an exasperated sigh as I was relayed the news, and mentioned I would just catch a bus a little ways uptown to go to another hotel. The girl behind the desk mentioned that there was one room she could put me in, at a discounted rate no less. She was, however, hesitant to do so, saying the owner of the hotel had taken it out of service for reasons unknown to her, but that she knew I would be gone before the owner would arrive in the morning, and she could fudge it in the system to look like the room hadn't been occupied. I thanked her for this and accepted, not caring for the other options I had available to me at the time. So I got the key and went into the room. I got undressed, showered, and settled into bed. I noted that despite her reservations, the room was immaculate. I simply couldn't fathom why a perfectly good room wasn't being rented out, but decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. The room was pretty standard as far as hotel rooms go. A single queen-sized bed, a TV on the wall to your left, a desk to your right, a mirrored closet door across from the bed with a table next to it, and a ceiling fan just past the foot of the bed. I fell asleep sometime around 11 to the sound of the TV playing some late-night cop drama. I was quite comfortable in the bed until around 2:30. I wasn't awoken by a sound as much as a lack of sound. You never realize how jarring silence is until it occurs suddenly in the night. As I rolled to sit up, I took note of the time on the alarm clock and noticed that the TV had turned off. The room was illuminated by the light of the parking lot pouring in through the blinds, and as my vision sharpened and the room properly came into focus, I noticed that I was not alone. At the foot of the bed was a woman. She was wearing a hotel bathrobe. Her hair was dark and wet, as if she had just gotten out of the shower. And notably, she was quite tall, the top of her head just 2 feet or so below the ceiling fan. She just stood at the foot of the bed with her head cocked to one side and stared at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. At some point during this exchange, I had convinced myself I was dreaming, and there was no woman in my room. So despite her standing there staring at me, I wasn't afraid. I had been having hyper-realistic dreams since I was a kid after all. So I simply laid back down on my back and watched her stand there, my head tilted so I could keep an eye on her, knowing that if I waited, she would simply disappear. And she did. I fell back to sleep and slept through to my morning wake-up call. The lady at the front desk sounded a bit nervous when she called, so I quickly got dressed and headed out to the front desk, thinking your boss may be coming by sooner than expected. I wasn't expecting the conversation I had at the front desk as I checked out. When I walked up, she started apologizing to me. I was confused, so I calmed her down and asked her to explain what had her so stressed. She took a breath and said, "I found out why that room was taken out of service. Come to find out, 2 weeks before I stayed in that room, a woman stayed there while on vacation with her husband and 2 kids. She stayed behind while they went to grab breakfast one morning. She took a shower, put on her bathrobe, and hanged herself with a bedsheet. Her husband found her there when he got back. The room was removed from service as a matter of good taste until the services were held. I didn't know any of this beforehand, and it makes me wonder, did I see her in my room that night, or was it really just a dream?" Back in 1999, before cell phones had cameras, my dad and I went to see his uncle up in the country. This was in the Philippines, by the way. Now, his uncle, who died in 2015, was an albaladio, or in English a healer or witch doctor, whatever term you want to use. This wasn't the first time we were going there, and I've been present during his healing sessions before. But this trip will forever be seared into my memories for as long as I live. We were on our second day there, shooting the shit with my dad's uncle and cousins over some drinks. I wasn't drinking because my dad wouldn't let me. I was barely 19 at that time, so I was having a Coke with ice. My dad's uncle wasn't drinking that day as well, because he said he was expecting a patient. The said patient arrived with her parents at around 3 p.m. Now, this girl was maybe 16 or 17, slim and petite, and was a real looker. Kinda looked like Maggie Q. My dad's uncle ushered them inside, leaving us on the front porch. About an hour later, my dad's uncle called us inside. He told us to change into white t-shirts. I didn't have one, so one of my dad's cousins lent me one. I didn't know what was happening, but apparently my dad knew, because he gave me a look that said, "Ask your questions later." The patient and her parents were inside the room my dad's uncle used during his healing sessions, and before he ushered us in, he uttered some phrases in a language I do not know, and rubbed some oil into our eyelids, ears, scalp, and cheeks. It smelled like coconut oil with something else mixed in it. We entered the room to see the girl dressed in a white ankle-length dress, lying on a low bamboo bed with her parents on either side of her. She had her eyes closed, and at first I couldn't put my finger on it, but something changed with her. I looked at her face, and then I saw it. She looked old. Not old, but she looked 20 years older. She looked like somebody else. There was a porcelain pot by the foot of the bed, and when I looked in it, it was filled with centipedes, and they were wet. My dad's uncle asked us to each take a limb and hold on tight. I grabbed one of her wrists, gently at first, because she was so slight I was afraid I would break it. But her father told me to grip her harder, so I did, with both hands. When we each had a wrist and an ankle secure, my dad's uncle started to mutter under his breath while rubbing oil on the girl's forehead. The parents stepped aside and moved to the foot of the bed. My dad's uncle took some branches with leaves, dipped them in oil, and started sprinkling the girl with them. The girl let out this long, low growl. I may have let out a girly scream like a little bitch, or I may not have, but at that point, I was so scared that I had a death grip on her wrists. She started thrashing around. All the while my dad's uncle was speaking to her in another language. I tried my best to keep her arm pinned to the bed, but it felt really strange, like she was on a raft. I looked down, and the bed was half a foot off the ground. I was so surprised that I lost concentration. The girl shook herself free of my grip and smacked me across the face so hard I was knocked out. Everything after this was relayed to me by my dad when I came to on the sofa in the living room. The girl's father took my place. The girl started talking back to my dad's uncle in a different language. According to my dad, this went on for quite a bit, with the girl even laughing a couple of times. My dad's uncle then took a length of black sewing thread, dipped it in oil, and laid it across the girl's throat. The girl started choking and turning blue. She stopped breathing. The parents understandably panicked, but my dad's uncle told them to wait, and sure enough, the girl gasped, opened her eyes, and started crying. Turns out, the girl was cursed by a badang, hired by a scorned suitor. A badang in the Philippines is something worse than a witch, and the centipedes inside the pot, they came crawling out of her vagina during the first hour we weren't in the room with them. A few days later, word got to us that another healer a few towns over died. The same night the girl was brought to my dad's uncle. He died of strangulation. So about 25 years ago, I worked for a company that hired handicapped people to work at various places, like recycling centers and so on. I primarily supervised 2 different crews, one during the week and one on weekends, of 2 persons apiece. Most of the people employed were mentally stunted in some capacity, but were genial and hard workers. The 2 weekend workers I hardly ever saw, so I'm going to focus on Amanda and Peter, not real names for privacy. Peter is the subject of the story, but Amanda was fascinating in her own right, as she admitted to me after working with her for a while that she never washed her clothes. She literally wore the same matted, dingy outfit every day, all day, and only bathed once a month. All of her teeth were blackened, rotten nubs, and the sheer unadulterated putrid smell that emanated from her body and her mouth was truly vile. I am not exaggerating by saying that I could not be within a few feet of her for more than a second, and even then, I held my breath. It was like an unholy, odorous aura enveloped her, and all that dared enter the festering vomit bubble that surrounded her would know instant suffering and wish for the sweet release of death. She was actually okay to deal with, and other than her extreme lack of any semblance of hygiene, was a good worker and generally amiable. But enough about her and her rancid debauchery. So the first thing you noticed about Peter was that he was large. I'm a stocky 6 foot who wears XL, and Peter made me look like a medium. He also had a metal prosthetic where his right hand used to be. Naturally, being young at the time and gregarious, I asked Peter what happened to his hand. Not immediately, but after working together for a while. He demurred and explained he didn't want to talk about it. During the interim, he told me he had schizophrenia and took lithium for psychosis. He was a big teddy bear generally, and unless spoken to was very quiet. To be honest, he was kind of a sad figure that projected a somber loneliness to him. He once told me about how he was a security guard at an abandoned warehouse and had to quit since he heard disembodied voices communicating to him from the machine/AC noises. Too much time alone, I guess. But mostly, he was just quiet and gentle when he was around me. If not approached, he could sit and stare at a wall for hours, and I'm not joking. We tended the grounds of an interstate rest area from late afternoon till late evening. I stayed there a couple hours after Amanda and Peter left, and one night Peter asked if he could stay and talk with me. This was almost a year after working together. I told him sure, but it'll have to be off the clock. We ended up sitting out in the company truck in the parking lot. It was about 11 p.m. We ended up talking about random things that I no doubt brought up, as he is so introverted. He suddenly asks me if I want to know what happened to his hand. Boy howdy. I tried not to show my excitement, but I had been morbidly curious for months. He tells me that when he was a teenager, that he got involved with a satanic cult. His words. In retrospect, he is from a small town and a very religious family. They were probably Wiccan or pagan or just having a laugh, but to him, as you'll see, it was anything but a laugh. So after a while, he becomes obsessed that these Satan worshippers had put the mark of the beast on his hand. He could not get the idea out of his head. I should also add, at this point he was not diagnosed as schizophrenic, and no one knew he was slowly losing touch with reality. Finally, after a few weeks of obsessing, he goes out to his parents' woodshed and takes a fishing knife and proceeds to cut off his own hand. I asked him what he felt, what he was thinking, what it looked like. He said he couldn't really feel much of it in his near-religious psychosis, but remembers when he cut through the tendons and viscera of the wrist, that they sprang back up into the forearm, like a taut rope suddenly released of pressure. He said all he could think over and over was, "I'm going to heaven," since presumably he had cut off the mark of the beast. Meanwhile, I can only imagine the blood-curdling screams probably got the attention of his poor parents. One or both of them rushed out to see what was wrong. Can you imagine finding your child covered in blood, missing a hand and ranting about the mark of the beast in Revelations? So they grab him and rush to the nearest hospital. Being a very small town, they flew him to a larger town with adequate facilities for such trauma. Before sending him, one of the doctors asked if they had brought the hand, as it could conceivably be reattached. In their haste and panic, his parents had overlooked it, so someone was sent back for the gruesome task of recovering the hand to send to the surgeons. The officer, or whomever was sent, went back, and the hand was gone. Now I know what you're thinking. Bullshit. I thought so too. But it makes sense when you think about it. We live out in the middle of the Ozarks. Either a dog, a raccoon, or a coyote could have got it. Who knows how long it took for all this to transpire. Anyway, he had surgery to heal the wound site, and was seen by a mental health professional post-haste, and subsequently diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. He later got fitted for one of those shoulder cable to open hook prosthetics. It gave him limited use, but was better than nothing. This was before the cool prosthetics they have now. I asked him what would have happened if they had found the hand and reattached it. He said at the time, and under his state of mind, he would have cut it off again. I haven't seen Peter in nearly 25 years, but I think about him a lot, and I hope he is doing better. My neighbor gifted me a vintage oil painting of Woody the Woodpecker. She purchased it from an auction a few months ago. She claimed there was a negative entity attached to it and could no longer handle the painting, so she asked if we wanted it. She didn't have any specific incidents occur just yet, aside from feeling negativity around it. My husband and I took the painting, not thinking much of it. We call the painting Woody. He and I have been paranormal investigating together the past 4 years, but we have never experienced something like this before. This painting is evil. The night we brought it home, the energy shifted. My dogs were extremely distressed and hid in our bedroom. Our baby also reacted in fear around the painting. We did a spiritual cleanse and put it in our garage. A couple days after we did the cleanse, I nearly choked to death in my sleep and had to be taken to the hospital. The doctor could not determine why this happened. At the time, I didn't think the painting had anything to do with it, but fast forward to this past weekend. We have now had Woody for about a month. I decided to do a spirit box session on the painting in my garage on Saturday night. The answers I received on the spirit box were too clear for my comfort. I heard,
"This is Woody. I'm angry.
and
I'm dangerous."
the word choke also came through a few times pretty clearly. I quickly ended the spirit box session after that and left my voice recorder in the garage overnight. The next morning, I played back the 6-hour recording and took notes of what I heard. There were a lot of footsteps in my garage, items being knocked off the shelves, loud thuds and bangs within close proximity to the painting, and various whispering between 1 to 3 a.m. that I could not make out. I was 2 hours into listening to the EVP that morning when my husband barged in the room screaming at me to get the baby and the dogs because our neighbor's house was on fire, the same neighbor who gifted us this painting. The fire department could not determine the cause of the fire. My neighbor asked me if I had recently done any paranormal investigating on Woody, and I told her everything about my spirit box session and EVP recording the night before. We all had this intense gut feeling that Woody was angry and caused the neighbor's house to catch on fire. We are now reaching out to experienced paranormal groups in the area to see if they want to keep the painting. I would hate to donate it to a Goodwill and have it end up in a child's room and cause harm to another innocent family. In the meantime, I will be reaching out to a professional for spiritual help. I need to get rid of the negative energy that Woody has caused. Two years ago, I took my wife, my father, and son, who was then 3, to visit family in rural New England. They live on a small farm with buildings that date back to the 1700s, which have been restored and modernized, and a guest house which was built about 20 years ago. My cousin is a prolific photographer, and my auntie had decorated most of the rooms in the main house and guest house with her photos. We didn't notice much about the photos in the guest house when we first arrived, probably because we were all jet-lagged. The next morning, after a sound night's sleep, we were sitting in the main family room eating breakfast and making plans for the day, when I noticed that my son was keeping his head down and not answering my father whenever he spoke to him, which was unusual because even at that young age they were very close. I looked over to my dad and noticed that he was sitting in front of a photo of a room in a run-down house. The room had a large window with sunlight streaming in, casting shadows across the length of the room towards a dark corner. I got an uneasy feeling from the photo, but didn't think much more of it. We finished breakfast and all got up from the table, and I noticed my son was walking in a wide arc around the end of the table where my father had been sitting. Again, weird behavior, but I just dismissed it as a weird 3-year-old thing. Over the next day or so, I noticed him becoming more and more uneasy any time we were at the dining table, and doing whatever he could to avoid looking at the photo. I decided to ask him what was wrong, and he answered me very matter-of-factly. "The bad man in the picture is looking at me. He's very cold, and he's not nice." I looked back at the picture and got instant chills down my spine. There was no man in the picture, but I got the feeling there was more to it than an empty room. I decided to ask my cousin about the picture, and she told me that it was taken at an abandoned farm a bit further upstate. It was one of her favorite pictures, but had always given my aunt the creeps, so it was moved to the guest house. Over the next couple of days, whenever I would ask my son about it, he would say things like, "The bad man is looking at me. He doesn't like me. He wants to hurt me." I still didn't think much of it until we were going to bed one night and my son tripped and fell, seemingly for no reason in the middle of the hall, and started crying hysterically. When I asked him if he was okay, he said, "The bad man hurt me on the leg." I checked his leg, and sure enough, On the side of his leg there was a large bruise that looked like he had been struck with a blunt object. I didn't want to play into his fears, but asked him how the bad man could hurt him if he was in the photo downstairs near the table. His answer was enough for me to pack up all our shit and move to the main house, with my aunt, uncle, cousins, and big burly housekeeper right away. He's not down there. He comes up here when we go to bed. We left soon after, so I never found out anything more about the farm where the photo was taken. But I'm sure there was some kind of evil presence around it. Anyone experienced something similar? Please share if you have. I saw the post about the living gnomes, so I thought I'd share one about a clown doll a family friend encountered. I'll start by saying I personally did not witness or experience this, but the story comes from a close family friend whom I consider reputable and honest. Personally, I'm rather skeptic when it comes to most paranormal activity, but I believe this story because of the man who told it. So, as a little bit of background, my father was a police officer for 25 years through the 80s and 90s. His best friends were mostly officers, so growing up I always met and was around cops. Some of my father's cop friends were annoying and rude, and some were really squared away nice guys. One in particular was my favorite. I won't use his real name, so I'll just refer to him as Bob. Bob was one of my father's closest friends and beat partner for a long time. He was an older African-American man from New Orleans. He was polite, had great mannerism, and carried himself confidently. My father used to say he was the most honest cop he'd ever worked with, and had solid integrity and bravery. One night, my father and him worked an off-duty job at some local event. A carnival or fair, I can't remember exactly, but there was a clown there. My father told me the entire night Bob was acting strange, acting uncomfortable, quiet and shy. When my father asked him what was wrong, Bob said, "I just hate clowns. Always have." My father started poking fun at him for being scared of the clown, and he said Bob just stared at him with this look that he had never seen him do before, like he was genuinely afraid. So my father asked why, and this is Bob's story. Bob grew up in New Orleans. When he was a child, his mom took him to stay at his aunt's house for a few weeks. Bob said he didn't care much for his aunt. She wasn't mean to him, but he always got a strange vibe when around her, like she carried an evil aura around with her. His family used to joke that his aunt was involved in voodoo and black magic, but they mostly just said these things in jest. His time at his aunt's was largely uneventful, with the exception of a strange rule she had. He was not allowed in the kitchen. Bob didn't understand why, but he followed it. On some nights, Bob claimed he heard his aunt talking to people in the kitchen at odd hours. In the mornings, he would ask her if she had friends over, and she would say she hadn't. Now his aunt had a thing for dolls. She had them all around the house. He hated them. He said whenever he passed by the cabinets displaying them, he always felt he was being watched. But she had one doll she always carried around and protected like a treasure. You guessed it, a clown doll. He said his aunt loved this thing, always took it with her around the house, caring for it as if it were a child. He didn't understand why. It was ugly and horrible looking, and he was frightened by that one the most. One night, he said he smelt his aunt baking something sweet and conversing with someone. He got excited and ran into the kitchen without thinking about his aunt's rule. When he ran in, he saw on the counter the clown doll, moving its mouth and speaking to his aunt in a man's voice. The clown turned its head and looked at Bob. His aunt turned around frantically and scolded him out of the kitchen. He said as she was rushing him out, he heard the clown doll laughing. After that night, he never left his room and barely slept. His aunt claimed he was imagining seeing the clown talk. He never went back after that incident. My father, who is a big-time paranormal skeptic, believes Bob. He said he'd never seen Bob's eyes or body language display so much discomfort and fear. He looked my dad square in the eyes and said, "I know what I saw and I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, it happened. That doll was alive. Whether you choose to believe it or not, I do, because I know Bob. And he's not the kind of guy to just make something up or claim something he wasn't for sure about. Hope you enjoyed."
Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Links to all my shit are in the description. I hope everyone is doing well. I love you guys. Until next time, be good to animals, even people. Shia.
This happened. This is not good that I'm laughing because nothing's funny, but I'm not going to get anything done if I. Alright. This is so stupid, dude. Alright. So the first thing you noticed about Peter was that he was large. We have now had Woody for about a month. That's my girl sleeping. Oh, she might have woke up. Are you listening to Daddy's story with the voice? Daddy's voice put your ass to sleep? Huh? Okay, well, shut up.